Hi, so this is for discussion number 7. My first key idea was 3.1, which says there are both structural and non-structural elements of the healthcare system that divide patients and practitioners. And in this chapter, the author really emphasized the structural factors that divide patients and providers. The first of these includes location. So what medicine used to be was a doctor, and a lot of people had one doctor that took care of all of their needs, their general checkups, delivered their babies, and they had house calls and had a personal relationship with their doctor. And now that the medical system has changed so much, there are no more house calls, and so patients now go to the office to see a doctor. And so they're not in their home, which is a familiar and more comfortable place. And so they're more vulnerable and probably, not as comfortable to, telling a story to a doctor that, they don't have as much of a personal relationship with. The second of these elements is specialties. So there used to not be as many specialties. And a doctor was a doctor, but now when you're a doctor, you could be several different type of doctor. So there are no more really personal doctors. So the patients don't have as personal of a relationship with their doctors, especially since they have so many more now. And the authors really talked about how the internists and internal medical doctors really changed the storytelling, medical interviewing to more of like questionnaires and a series of yes-no questions, which mostly eliminates the opportunity for the patient to tell their story because there were no open-ended questions for them. And the third is time. So when doctors made house calls, they had so much time to spend with patients and they had less patients to see. But especially now that the location and doctors don't make house calls and all the patients have to go to them, they could fit in more patients in a shorter amount of time and make more money. So now they've practically eliminated the time that patients would have to tell their story. My next key idea was 4.1. And this one says, illness disrupts a person's life narrative, making that person vulnerable. Such an ill person seeks through a relationship with a caregiver to reconstruct the life narrative in ways that offer healing. And so in our book, the author says that in illness, the patient's story takes a sudden turn and they are left in uncharted territory. So I think this key idea really relates well to the story of Nicholas that we read for this module. And so Nicholas was just a 6-year-old kid, and so obviously if you were writing a story for someone's life, a brain tumor was not supposed to be in Nicholas's story. And the authors of our book, The Narrative in Healthcare, say that to facilitate healing, the patient must be understood. And I think in this situation, in the story of Nicholas, the doctors had to understand not just Nicholas, but also his mother, Pat. And I think the author that wrote this story, the doctor, did a really good job of understanding Nicholas's mother, Pat, in the way of letting Pat tell stories about Nicholas and how much he changed her life and, just how much joy he has brought to her. And so during this story, Pat really made the best of a bad situation and found a way to continue Nicholas's narrative. And she did this by donating his organs because she knew that Nicholas was such a generous kid that would have been something that he would have wanted. She started to make a needlepoint of Nicholas's favorite nighttime prayer, so she would remember to say that prayer and continue Nicholas's memory. And she also gave his toys to the neighbor boy who he had previously given toys to because, again, he was just such a generous kid. And so she wanted to do things that would have honored his memory. And so, I think this doctor did a really good job of getting to know Pat and even, months later called up to check up on Pat and see how she was doing and really created an environment so that and with talking with Pat could facilitate healing for her. My last key idea was 4.2, which says many models exist to describe the special features of the patient-caregiver relationship. A narrative approach to that relationship enables the fully competent caregiver to provide care within all such models, balancing logico-scientific with narrative competence. So in our book, and throughout this whole course, we've learned that providers need to provide both medical and, be able to help provide spiritual care for their patients. And in our book, The Narrative in Healthcare, the authors mentioned someone named Howard Brody, and he says that a physician or a provider has 3 different powers. And these powers are Aesculapian power, which is deriving from the specialized training in the profession of medicine. So this is really where, doctors and providers learn how to provide the medical care, for the actual biological processes and the body. The second power is charismatic power, which is arising from the physician's own personal attributes and interpersonal abilities. And I think this is really a lot of how a provider can provide spiritual care. And, something a lot of people that we were called to this field, because they want to get to know the patient and want to help them. And I think that's, one of the components to, that helps balance out the scientific training they've had and be able to provide spiritual care well. And the last power is social power, which is more of resulting from the status of the physician granted by society in return for upholding medicine's contract with society. And that's more of just, I don't think balancing out, but just performing and fulfilling their responsibilities as providers.